even more precarious.
Thank you. Let me begin with Dr. Carlicar and Mr. Mahoney. Kind of a similar question that I asked Mr. Posner, because I'm always trying to figure out what is it that we can do here that can actually be helpful. I mean, how can we be most effective? How can we, try to change the sad reality that in a lot of places around the world, journalists are being persecuted or being jailed or tortured, or in some cases they're losing their lives. And so how would you rate the U.S. government on the issue of promoting media freedom overseas? What do we do well? What can we do better? What is the most important thing that the U.S. can do to promote press freedom overseas?
You go? Okay. Well, I think some things are being done well, and I would advocate for continued efforts, sort of diplomatic efforts like this hearing to raise attention to the issues and to draw attention to specific cases. I think things like the Magnitsky Bill are very effective ways to address some of these issues, so I would advocate, for efforts like that. I think in terms of, funding and programmatic efforts, there is a fair amount of money being given to media development and to promoting press freedom by various branches of the U.S. government, but I would continue for continued and more funding, particularly I think in a more sort of long-term and systematic way. A lot of the funding is year on year, and it's very difficult for the people who implement these programs to actually be able to, I think, implement them well when a lot of the funding is very piecemeal and you only get a certain amount at a certain time. Particularly, I would highlight sort of helping programs to help train journalists in investigative reporting in terms of protecting themselves via physical security and cybersecurity efforts, and also helping local advocates to be effective do effective monitoring and advocacy in their own countries. We have found, I think, that the combination of sort of international pressure from the U.S. government side, from international NGOs such as ourselves and the Committee to Protect Journalists, and then in addition to helping provide support to help equip local advocates is really the best way to help, for example, promote sort of legal or regulatory reform and some of these sort of systematic efforts which, and it's good to put in place, I think, for particular countries, because that's really where you build foundations. Obviously, dealing with some of the more authoritarian and repressive governments is a whole other ballgame, but I think we have seen a lot of positive developments, for example, in certain countries in Africa with regard to passing freedom of information legislation, with regard to decriminalizing libel. So I think continued funding for programs like that is very, very important.
I think when it comes to repression of press freedom and violation of journalists' rights, silence is the enemy. And therefore, I think that the United States and Western democracies generally must speak out every time there is a death of a journalist or every time a piece of repressive legislation is proposed or pushed through. And I think that the United States, both bilaterally and within the multilateral organizations of which it's a member, must have press freedom as one of its concerns. And I think that the State Department has been pushing on that front. I would say that whilst training of journalists and improvement of the professionalism of journalists is an important element, we would say that without the ability to write, it doesn't matter how well you write. So you must push for the climate of repression to be rolled back. And one area where I think the United States can be particularly effective is in online repression. We are seeing internet censorship growing. We are seeing dual-use technologies being exported. We are seeing countries that are pushing back against the progress that journalists have been able to enjoy because the cost of reporting has come down with new technologies. This is particularly important in a continent like Africa, where companies are exporting technologies for internet surveillance and filtering. Countries like China are doing particularly well in this regard, and U.S. allies such as Ethiopia are extremely adept at implementing these new internet censoring and filtering technologies. So that's an area where I think across a whole theme, a whole subject area, the United States could push because it is the world's leading country for Internet and Internet technology.
Thank you. Father Moreno and Mr. Calamirza, kind of a similar question to you. What could the United States do that would be the most help to improve the climate for press freedom in your home country? Are there things that we're doing now that are helpful, that we should do more of? Are there things that we should be doing that we're not doing? We're looking for suggestions, obviously, to try to, go beyond this hearing to figure out ways that we can actually, help try to reverse this trend.
Revertir esta tendencia.
Lo que hacen de escuchar a sectores con los que tradicionalmente no tienen una relación y alianza es positivo, pero es demasiado poco.
I think anything you can do to listen to sectors with whom you have not traditionally had alliances will be good. What's being done now is not enough.
Lo digo algo en negativo. ¿Qué puede hacer el gobierno de Estados Unidos? Dejar de escuchar y atender menos a sus propios aliados en Honduras, porque sus aliados en Honduras son los más enemigos de la democracia.
And I can say it in a more negative way. I think you need to stop, the government of the United States needs to stop listening as much to its allies in Honduras, because those are the very people that are the enemies of democracy right now.
E igualmente, apoyar a las instancias internacionales como la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, porque en la experiencia nuestra en Radio Progreso es en donde más hemos tenido respaldo y apoyo.
I think another positive step is to support the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. In our experience in the radio station that I work at, that's where we have found the most support.
Well, just before you, just like a follow-up, I mean, you mentioned the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I'm just, what's your assessment? Some protective orders have been given to help try to protect journalists. How effective are they? I mean, and how can we make them more effective? I mean, I know the Inter-American Commission ordered the government of Honduras to protect journalists in the face of the fact that many journalists were being killed. I'm just trying to figure out, is the government of Honduras doing what it's supposed to do?
Las medidas cautelares son simbólicas.
The protective measures are symbolic largely.
Permítame contarle mi testimonio personal.
Perhaps I can tell you my personal story.
Me reuní con un oficial responsable de una región, de la región nuestra, un oficial de la policía.
I had a meeting with a police official who was responsible for our geographic area.
Y cuando le hablé de las medidas cautelares que teníamos, me respondió lo siguiente.
And when I told him that we had these protective measures, he responded in the following way.
¿En qué cosas malas andan ustedes para gozar de esas medidas?
He said, what bad things are you involved in that you have to have those kinds of measures?
Las medidas cautelares son importantes, pero se necesita información, se necesita formación y se necesitan mecanismos para que funcionen.
So the protective measures are indeed important, but they need to be accompanied with more information, more training, and mechanisms to make sure they actually function.
Mr. Calamirza, if you could give me your kind of analysis of how we can be of help and what we can do better, if there are things that we're doing that are helping, I'd be curious to get your guidance on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first of all, I'd concur that attention is very important, drawing attention and keeping those issues in the spotlight.
Is your mic on?
I think so. I could bring it a bit closer. Is that better like this?
Yeah, it's better. Good.
Thank you. I would concur that drawing attention to these issues and keeping them in the spotlight is extremely important. And, you know, we always say that bringing democracy and freedom to Russia is our own task, is the task of Russian civil society. So, you know, nobody can or should do it for us from outside. But having said that, the United States is a full member of the OSCE, together with the Russian Federation, and as such, the OSCE mechanisms, you know, directly provide for the fact that human rights cannot be considered an internal affair. So you know that the Russian Foreign Ministry likes to issue these statements about interfering in internal affairs. Well, the Moscow document of the OSCE clearly states, as you well know, that human rights, rule of law, and democracy issues are not internal affairs. So you have a full right to be concerned about them as an OSCE member state. And I think as important as the just drawing attention and making statements and passing resolutions is, I think you really hit the spot there with the Magnitsky Act, and you can see it by the hysterical reaction, you know, coming from the Kremlin. And this is why a large, you know, segment of Russian civil society supports this, because for now that may well be the only disincentive for human rights violations and for corruption for officials in the present Russian regime. Especially important is the, I believe it's Article 4 of this bill, which widens the provisions to not just, you know, to those involved in the Magnitsky case, but also to other human rights violators. So I think that's very important. So that this bill serves not just, you know, a way to bring justice to Sergei's killers and those implicated in his case, but also as a preventative measure against future human rights violations. Because, you know, these people in the current Russian regime who rule, you know, like in the style of Zimbabwe or Belarus, they themselves like to keep, you know, their money, their assets in the West. They want a vacation in the West. They send their kids to schools to the West. And this, you know, personal accountability may well be the only thing that will make them think twice. And that Article 4, which, for instance, includes the freedom of expression, which is directly relevant to what we're talking about, as well as democratic elections and right to a fair trial. You know, for instance, that would include those who actively aid and abet censorship. For instance, I don't know, the heads of the state-run television or other people. I mean, that's the beauty of this bill, and that's where it's most important, I think.
Let me ask you, going back to, you know, to your individual case. You know, you talked about that the President Putin's first deputy chief of staff ordered that you no longer be allowed to work as a journalist.
That's what we heard. Boris Nemtsov found this out, and two sources have confirmed the same name to me.
But more broadly, is it known how high up in the Russian government that the decisions on media censorship tend to be made? I mean, how high up does it go? All the way up, or?
Well, for instance, when the Kremlin was destroying NTV, which I mentioned, I mean, everybody knew that Putin was personally involved in that. Okay. And that was very much a personal, just as he was personally involved in the persecution of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Russia's most famous political prisoner. Like these big cases, he usually gets involved himself. But the kind of their point man for controlling TV for the past decade has been a man called Vladislav Surkov, who used to be the deputy chief of staff of the Kremlin. He was, well, officially he resigned. He was dismissed, whatever, you know, the word we choose to use, at the height of the anti-government protest in December. He was dismissed as the most kind of odious figure, you know, the symbol of the authoritarianism and the media censorship and the repression. He was moved to a lesser position in the Russian cabinet rather than the Kremlin. So I don't think there's a single replacement to Mr. Surkov, who would, for instance, be a prime candidate for the Magnitsky bill sanctions, as in fact he was discussed in this context here many times. But his former replacement is Mr. Volodin, who is now the deputy chief of staff responsible for internal politics. But it looks like this Mr. Gromov, whom you mentioned, I mentioned, it looks like he's the one responsible for the media sphere and media censorship now.
Thank you. Mr. Mahoney.
He would be a candidate for that as well.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, yeah. I believe that the Magnitsky bill is going to pass the House and Senate, and I believe it will be the law in this country. So, Mr. Mahoney, do you believe that the Turkish Prime Minister and other leaders have been or are likely to be responsive to domestic and international criticism regarding the repression of media freedom? You know, I mean, I'm just trying to think, you know, what means are most effective to communicate kind of the U.S. views on these issues, because again, we're hearing more and more complaints about the situation in Turkey, and I'm just trying to get your sense on that.
I think a clear statement from the United States would be very, very effective. I think that Turkey is a pro-Western country, and it cares very deeply about its image in the West. It cares about its interests in the West. It has applied to join the European Union. It's a NATO member, and therefore what we say to Turkey really matters. And I think that what's happened so far is that Turkey's got a pass on this. And it's been able to imprison journalists and repress legitimate reporting, and no one has really called them out on it.
This is a question for any one of you or all of you, I guess. Do you think the international mainstream media is doing enough to highlight the plight of journalists who are being oppressed in different parts of the world? It seems to me that given the severity of the situation, that we ought to read more about it. I love the press. I'm not. We're here in Congress, but I guess I'm just. One of the ways to put pressure on countries is when you pick up the, major newspapers or major international networks, and you read about or you see about not just the most horrific cases, but there are a lot. Preparing for this hearing, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of cases all over the world, and I'm not quite sure how much the average person in this country quite appreciates that.
Well, I've been a professional journalist all my life, and I can tell you that my colleagues, my former colleagues and my present colleagues are deeply concerned about this and take every opportunity that they can to write about it. But if I could go back to a point I made in my presentation, which is that most of the journalists who are jailed or killed are local journalists working in their own countries. We fall into the problem of foreign news reporting.
Right.
And many outlets in the West have shrunk their international correspondence networks, closed foreign bureaus. So we, as consumers of news in the West, I think, are deprived of foreign news generally, and therefore of news about press freedom violations in foreign countries in particular.
I think there is a fair, as Rob said, there's a fair amount of coverage, I think, of the bigger cases. I think what is harder, or maybe harder to sell as a news story, are some of these more systematic issues, such as things like licensing and regulatory frameworks, or things that may not be as sexy, but or attention grabbing, but which are very, very important mechanisms to control the press. And I think the other thing that could be, I think, maybe done better is drawing the connection between what's happening when a journalist gets killed and how that affects the society as a whole. It's not, obviously it's horrible for the journalist, for their family, for the profession, but it can also lead to very widespread self-censorship. It can lead to citizens in a country not getting news about very important social or economic issues. So I think also, getting journalists in the media to try and draw those linkages and to make sure that, when they write stories, it's made clear that this is not just an issue for the media itself, but affects everyone in the country. I think that would do a lot to sort of build public awareness of some of these issues and make people realize how important the issue is. I know in Russia, for example, many Russian citizens don't really think press freedom is a very important issue. They don't really care, So I think to try and draw those linkages and make citizens more aware of how it affects them and is not just affecting the journalistic and media profession is also very important, for the media to do and for other advocates to do as well.
I think on Russia, the world press has generally presented an adequate picture. I think that the impression that people have here in Western Europe about the situation with media freedom in Russia, or the absence of media freedom in Russia, is pretty accurate. But I would certainly concur that, of course, the bigger and the cases with the bigger names, or the tragedies such as Anna Politkovskaya's murder, or Yuri Shekhachikin, or Natalia Stemirev, and others, they naturally draw more attention than the...
I think you're right on Russia, but I don't pick up the Washington Post and read about Honduras every day.
Oh, absolutely.
Or every week, and that's the, and so, and again, I don't, obviously you can't cover everything can't be covered in a single newspaper on a single TV, but nonetheless in areas that, where the situation seems to be kind of on the downward swing, a little added attention might actually, reverse that trend.
Absolutely. And more Russians now do care about issues of political freedom and press freedom and others, as we've seen this trend over the past few months. So I think it's important to keep the coverage going and keep these issues in spotlight.
La cobertura no se corresponde con la gravedad de lo que ocurre con los periodistas.
I think the coverage doesn't correspond necessarily to the seriousness of what's happening with journalists in any given situation.
Es necesario, pienso yo, que los periodistas alcancen un nivel de libertad y de organización que vaya más allá de los propietarios de los medios.
I think it's also very important that journalists can reach a level of freedom and ability to organize that go beyond the interests of the owners of the media outlets.
Porque el problema vital de humanidad es de los periodistas, y creo que desde la perspectiva de Honduras, la cobertura depende más del interés de los propietarios de los medios que condicionan y coartan la propia libertad de los periodistas.
So I think the vital problem for humanity in this case is what's happening with the journalists, but in Honduras and many other places, I think what's covered in the news corresponds more to the interests of the owners than the interests of the journalists themselves, and that's what we would have to try to change.
No. Well, look, I appreciate you all being here, and I appreciate your incredible patience, and I apologize again for the interruption of the hearing, but this is a very important issue for this commission, and as all you have mentioned, I mean, it's beyond just the individual journalist that we're concerned about here, is that when you arrest somebody, or somebody has disappeared because of what they write, it does have a chilling impact on society, on democracy, on freedom of expression. Nobody wants to go to jail. Nobody wants to go through what some of these journalists have gone through, and one of the things I hope that you will do, in the weeks and months ahead, is if there are specific things that you think we can advocate that we're not currently advocating, I hope that you'll feel free to contact this commission. I mean, our job is about upholding human rights. This is an important part of human rights. A free press, journalistic freedom, people being able to say what they want and write what they want, and again, I don't always agree with everything that's written about me, but the fact of the matter is that's what a free society is all about. I mean, people can say whatever they want, and there's nothing unpatriotic about that. So, in any event, I appreciate all the work that you do. I thank you for your courage, and I thank you for continuing your work on these issues, and hopefully we'll be able to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much.